was on the playground when I was that little girl who used to ask a lot of questions. And I stepped out to run an errand. I was on my way on the freeway, going to the mall, and I had an epiphany at that moment. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if I can interview these amazing women in my life and share their stories? I'm an avid podcast listener, and I have a very long commute going into work every day. I live in Dublin and I work in San Francisco. So I have a lot of time to kill, and as many of you know, the traffic in the Bay Area is awful. So I listen to these podcasts, and who here knows what a podcast is? Okay, we have a few folks. A podcast is basically listening to a story on demand. So you can listen to the radio, or you can go to iTunes or SoundCloud, and you can listen to any topic. There's several stories, and you can listen to podcasts, and you can listen to them whenever you want. So that's the beauty of it. It's kind of like YouTube for the radio or for your iPhone. So I would listen to all these podcasts, and I noticed that they were all for white men. And the ones that I listened to, they were all white men. And I thought to myself, why isn't there a podcast for Asian women? I mean, even women in particular, but Asian women. And the reason why I thought of Asian women is because, as you all know, there's a lot of barriers for Asian women. There are the social customs, there are the traditions. Those are the barriers that you bring from home, but there are also other barriers within the professional world. There are a lot of stereotypes against Asian women. And when I say Asian women, I'm identifying India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, China, Japan, all of these countries, the Philippines. There's a lot of perceptions and stereotypes that women have to face. And so I thought of creating this platform to have these women share their stories and talk about their journeys and how they became successful and what sort of risks they took and what barriers they had to overcome. And I thought of this idea of starting this platform called Confessions of Successful Asian Women. And I conceived this idea last August. I was naive. I thought that I could do this overnight, but it took a long time. And it took 6 months for me to get it started, to find someone who could help me design the website, who could design this logo right here. I needed to learn how to do podcasting. I'd never, this is not my profession, so I did a lot of YouTubing and searching on the internet. And it took 6 months for me to get this going, and I finally launched the podcast on International Women's Day in March. So today I'm going to share some of the lessons that I've learned. When you go to the website, you'll see 19 interviews from the women that throughout this time, and I wanted to show a diversity of women. As you all know, there's not everyone ends up becoming a doctor or engineer. There's so many interesting backgrounds. There's women who are running dance academies, who are authors, who are doing many different things. So I wanted to show that diversity, and so far there's 19 episodes, and I'm still going. So what are some of the lessons that I learned as a result of this? The first lesson is each woman that I interviewed had a vision. They stuck to that vision. They had a compass that was guiding them. A lot of times we have so many things that come in our way. There's adversity, there are trials, there's, all sorts of things that can come in your way. And what made these women stand out is that they continued to hold on to that vision because they had this goal that they wanted to achieve. And I wanted to share the story of one woman here. This is Myra Nawabi. Myra is currently in the Silicon Valley, and Myra is an former Afghan refugee. Her family was impacted by the war. When the Russians were in Afghanistan, she lost her father to the war. She came from a noble background. Her family was a ruling family. They ruled Afghanistan for many years. And suddenly they had to flee. So she, her mother, and her two siblings had to flee Afghanistan. And she talks about the story of her escape and how they had to pay smugglers to get them across from Afghanistan to Pakistan. And it took them 2 weeks to make that journey. And they made it in the dead of winter. This is in the month of December. And as you know, Afghanistan is a very cold place. They had to do it during the night because they did not want to be seen or get caught by the government. So Myra also had a dream. She had a dream to get an education and to someday become an astronaut. She was very fascinated with the moon and the stars, and she wanted to become an astronaut one day. Myra talks about one incident where after walking 12 hours a day, she was so tired and she was holding the caravan back. And the smugglers, the smugglers would get these people across. The smuggler turned to her mother and said, "Why is your daughter not walking?" And Myra's mom told the smuggler that she was very tired, that she, was feeling very weak. And so the smuggler said to her mom, "Do you want me to get her to walk?" And the mother said yes. And so the smuggler then took out his gun, pointed at Myra, and said, "Walk or I'll shoot." And she ran. And it's just an example of, of the adversity that she had to face. She eventually made it to Pakistan and was in Islamabad for 2 years. And then finally they got on the plane for the U.S. And while she was in the U.S., she faced a lot of adversity. She faced discrimination. She was in Florida, of all places. And as you all know, Florida is an interesting place to be. It's always been an interesting place to be. And Myra always held on to that vision of wanting to get an education. However, her mother wanted her to get married, and all of her family members wanted her to get married. So Myra negotiated a deal with her mother and said, "If you let me go to college, I will marry the person that you choose for me." And they struck a deal. So Myra got accepted into this aeronautical engineering program in Arizona. She got there, however, it was a very challenging program for her because she did not get support in the program. It was a very male-dominated program. And she also had to put herself through school. She worked full-time as well. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to complete the program. She kept her word, got married to the person that her mother wanted her to marry, found herself in New York, and while she was expecting, she enrolled herself in a program at a university in New Jersey, and she would travel 4 hours a day to that university while she was expecting, and she enrolled in a computer science program. And she had a very difficult pregnancy, so she had to drop out of the program. And then suddenly she found her husband. Her husband got a job in the Valley, and they moved to the Bay Area. Myra was still dedicated to her vision. She wanted to get that education, and she enrolled herself in a program, in a teaching credential program, and at that point she had delivered her daughter. At the same time, her marriage was unraveling, and she had to make a choice, either to stay married to her husband or to continue with her dream. And she talks about a point where she was in the courtroom fighting the custody battle, where she was on one side of the courtroom alone, and her husband and her own family members had abandoned her, were on the other side of the courtroom. And she was able to win the custody battle. She eventually finished her education, got her teacher credential, but when she was teaching, she felt like there was something missing, and she wanted to pursue her dream of getting connected to space somehow. So she got an internship at Lockheed Martin, and she was offered a role, and now she's a senior project engineer for Lockheed Martin. And just a couple weeks ago, she was at the space station. She was able to see her satellite take off. And I wanted to highlight through this story is that Myra faced so much adversity in her life, but she had two things that she was very sure about, which was to get an education and to somehow get connected to space. And she was able to do that. It wasn't a straight path. She had a lot of adversity come in the way, but she was able to do it because that was her vision, and she stuck to it. I was listening to an interview once, and the guest was asked the question, what advice would you give to your 30-year-old self? And the guest said, don't be a donkey. What I mean by that is don't have one foot stuck in water and the other in hay. Stick to a vision, stick to one thing. Don't try to do everything at once. Do one thing at a time. And this is just a story that I wanted to highlight with how one woman stuck to her vision and was able to accomplish her version of success. The next one is one thing that was very apparent in all of my interviews is that these women took risks. And we live here in the Silicon Valley, and the motto is fail forward, fail fast, take risks. It's easier said than done, right? Who wants to take risks? Who wants to fail? But these women did take risks, and taking risks is not knowing whether or not this risk is going to pay off. And the next story that I want to highlight is the story of Gunita Singh Bala. Gunita Singh was born in Punjab in India, and when she was a little girl, she used to hear stories about partition. Her family was affected by partition. They had to move from Lahore to Amritsar, and she loved hearing those stories. She left India and came to the U.S. to continue her education. And while she was going through school, she was taking history classes, and in all the history books, she noticed that there was no mention of the partition. The partition is the event that took place in 1947, and this is for our younger girls, when India gained its independence from the British and Pakistan broke off into its separate sovereign nation. As a result of partition, there were 2 million people who were killed, and this was one of the biggest genocides of our history, of modern history. But there was no mention of this event in the books. And Gunita felt it. She recognized that while she was going through school. Gunita decided to pursue a path in physics, and she was very interested in physics. She got her PhD in physics, and she was living in Japan for a little bit and decided to pay a visit to the Hiroshima Peace War Memorial Museum. She visited the oral archive portion of the museum, and she had an epiphany. She said to herself, I want to create legitimacy for the partition event. I want to build an archive, a memorial for the partition survivors. And she came up with this idea, this is like crazy idea that she wanted to record 10,000 stories of the partition survivors. So she packed up her bags and went to India, and at that time, this is several years ago, the technology wasn't as great, she started interviewing people. She came back to the US and she enlisted volunteers to help her with this project. At the same time, she was working for Lawrence Livermore Lab as a physicist. And she had to come to a decision. She had come to a fork in the road. Either she was going to continue her physics career, or she was going to build this partition archive and build this nonprofit. And she was so passionate about the partition and continuing to build on her dream that she chose to leave her physics career and focus on creating this nonprofit. And it was not an easy path for her. She had to, as you all know, this is a nonprofit as well, you have to do a lot of fundraising, ask people for donations. And she had to learn the ins and outs of how to start your own nonprofit, how to get funding, how to have a board of advisors, all the ins and outs of starting this big venture. And she knew that there was no turning back, that this is what she wanted to do. She had this dream of building this war memorial in India to commemorate the partition survivors. And I just wanted to highlight that here's someone who took a huge risk. She spent her early part of her life in this PhD program thinking that she would be on this path in science, but she made a pivot and she wanted to do something that was much more meaningful to her. And you know, Benita is still collecting stories. She has volunteers in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and she's still on the mission to build this memorial museum, and her project is called the 1947 Partition Archive. You can learn more about her project online. She also has a Facebook page. She shared one story in the interview, and maybe I can play a clip for you, but how she interviewed this man who was in his 80s, and he told her, he said that he could finally die now because he shared the story, like he wanted to get this off of his chest before he passed away. And after he shared his story, he passed away a year later. And it's incredible how she's been able to lead this project and you know, give a legitimacy to these people who suffered as a result of this. The next one is knowing your strengths. And how many of you have heard to always focus on your strengths and not your weaknesses? That's a very common piece of advice, you know, no matter where you go in your life. One story that I wanted to share is that of Farah Yasmin Sheikh. Farah is also based out of the Bay Area, and Farah is a Kathak dancer. And she recently did several shows on the book The 20th Wife. The 20th Wife is a novel by Indu Sundarasan, and it's a novel about Nur Jahan and her marriage to Jahangir, Emperor Jahangir, and it talks about the Mughal times in that period. And Nur Jahan was one of the most powerful women in that time during the Mughal era. Farah, as a young girl, she's a Pakistani Muslim American, and when she was a young girl, she loved dancing. She loved Western forms of dance. She took tap dancing. She and the great thing is that her parents encouraged it. So she did several dance programs, and when she found herself at San Francisco State, she found out that there was a Kathak that was being offered, and this was by the Pandit Chitra Das, who's a renowned Kathak dancer in the Bay Area. He has since passed away. And so she told her parents that she wanted to do Kathak dancing, and her father was very supportive. Her mother was a little bit hesitant, and she became a Kathak dancer. And Kathak is a very difficult dance to learn. There's a lot of rhythm, and it's very different from Western forms of dance. Farah today is teaching young girls Kathak dance. She has toured to Pakistan and India, and she has taught the dance of Kathak to Pakistani girls who haven't been exposed to Kathak. And this is her way of really sharing a piece of history to these young girls. And the reason why I bring up Farah's story is because Farah knew what she was good at, and her strength was dance. And as much as we want to tell our children to do the things that we want them to do, she knew what her strengths were, and as a result, she was supported by her parents, she was supported by her husband, her in-laws. They were participating in her programs. And as much as there was stigma with dance, especially in the South Asian Muslim culture, she was true to herself, and she knew that this is something that she wanted to do. And Farah's just one woman that I interviewed. Another one is Meenal Mehta, who went to UC Berkeley, then went to Harvard Business School. Now she started these Bolly X training centers. It's basically Bollywood dance. and she's created a huge business empire as a result of this. And both of these women knew what their strengths were, and they followed on their strengths. Find the right partner. So for the women that I interviewed and the ones who are married, they were successful because they had very supportive partners. I don't know if you've read, how many of you know who Ruth Bader Ginsburg is? Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the Supreme Court Justice. She's one of 3 women in the U.S. Supreme Court right now, and she's a very strong, fierce woman. She recently wrote an article for the New York Times where she gave advice to young girls. And the one piece of advice that she gave is to always marry the right person. And Ruth is not the only one who said this, but how many of you know Sheryl Sandberg? Sheryl Sandberg is the Chief Operating Officer for Facebook, and in her book, Lean In, this is what she wrote. When it comes time to settle down, find someone who wants an equal partner, someone who thinks women should be smart, opinionated, and ambitious, someone who values fairness and expects, or even better, wants to do his share in the home. And I bring this up because in our culture, we are very quick to arrange our daughters to get married and to just find someone who's educated, who's smart, who can provide for you. But the important piece that we're missing is this person going to be supportive of you? And all the women that I've interviewed who are currently married, they have extremely supportive partners. They've been there with them, they encourage them to follow their dreams. And one woman that I wanted to highlight here is Dr. Amita Roy Shah. And Dr. Amita Roy Shah received her PhD in education from Columbia. She wrote 2 books. One book is on Holi, the other one is on Diwali. And when she was married and had her first child, she was at the graduation ceremony of her sister-in-law in Columbia. Amita and her husband both reside in the Bay Area. She was in Columbia, and she said to her husband, like, wow, this is such a great school. I would love to do, my graduate degree here. And her husband said, let's do it. So they packed their bags. She got into the program. They packed their bags, and they moved to New York. And some of you may know that doing your PhD is extremely stressful. There's a lot of work. You have to write thousands of pages of thesis. And she was able to do it because her husband encouraged her to do it. She got support from her in-laws, from her family members. She had her dissertation on her kitchen table while she was cooking. And so it was amazing that her husband was there for her. And Amita Roy Shah is not the only one, but there were several women that I interviewed who had very supportive partners. And it's important to note that when we're encouraging our daughters, especially for younger women, it is important to marry the right person, to marry someone who's going to support you in your dreams. So what have I learned in this whole process? I came across this quote, and this quote is, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." It's a Leonardo da Vinci quote. And the reason why I brought this up is because I feel this way about my podcast. It's a never-ending creative journey, and there's been a lot of mistakes that I've made. Some are costly. I had no idea what I was getting into. I had to come up with the logo, come up with the website, and I learned a lot of lessons along the way. And to be honest with you, there were times when I wanted to give up because I felt like I wasn't good enough, and I was comparing myself to the big, podcast stars. And I realized that, with everything, things take time. We live in a culture right now where everything's got to be instant. You think people become entrepreneurs or millionaires or famous overnight, but you don't see the hard work that goes into it, in the background. And for me, it was a lot of work. I had, my family, I had my job, and I was trying to make this podcast, make it better. And one thing that I've noticed, especially now, is that, we all are so limited on time. They say time is a non-renewable resource. You can never get time back. And I was competing for people's time, so I had to make these stories very interesting, where they would hold their attention and they would want to listen. And so there are a lot of things that I've learned along the way, and it's still a work in progress. It's not something that is complete yet. I'm still going, and I'm still looking for ways to improve the experience. They say that the soul is contained in the voice, and it's so true. We live in a culture right now where everyone loves to talk, but no one likes to listen. And, we have our elders here in the room, we've got our younger generation in the room. Talk to people, ask questions, be curious, get to know people, be like that 8-year-old kid who wants to know what they've been doing, what they're doing at night, what they're doing on the weekend. And it's so amazing how many relationships you can build as a result of just talking to people and asking questions. And I encourage all of you to build those relationships. It's so easy these days to just be on your phone, on your technology, and not talk to people. And when you talk to people, you learn so much about them. You learn about their history and where they came from. They get to share so many great things with you. You have this bond that you build. And I encourage all of you, especially the younger generation, to start talking to the people. I read an article once, and it was through the World Economic Forum, that the 2 most important skills for the jobs of the future, one is math, right? STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And the other one is communication skills. How do you talk to people? And I'm afraid that, we're lacking those skills as time goes on. So I hope you took away a few things from my presentation, and I hope that I'm encouraging you to also do something creative, and you get to live out your purpose as well. Everyone has a purpose in life. Everyone's put on this earth for a reason. And just start questioning yourself. Think about the things that you love to do. Think about your strengths and act on them. Life is too short. Things can change in a minute. Thank you so much for having me today.